You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 367, The Grand Compromise of 1790. Now, for the last few episodes, we've been going through some of the most important legislation that the new federal government created in its first year or two in office. Now, there are two controversial issues that I've largely avoided discussing because I wanted to devote a full episode to those issues and how they came to be resolved together. One of the biggest debates was over where to move the new federal capital. During the Revolutionary War, the Congress had met primarily in Philadelphia, which was relatively central and was also the largest city on the continent. Congress fled the city a few times, moving temporarily to Baltimore, Maryland, and York, Pennsylvania, when the British Army threatened. Toward the end of the war, the delegates didn't think that Pennsylvania was doing enough to protect them from angry Continental soldiers who were demanding their promised pay and benefits. Congress moved to Princeton, New Jersey for a time, then Annapolis, Maryland, which is where the Army finally disbanded in 1783. After that, Congress moved to Trenton, New Jersey the following year, and then to New York City the year after that. Now, it remained in New York City for 4 years until the U.S. Congress took over from the Confederation Congress in 1789. The new U.S. Congress continued to meet in New York City. Even before enough congressmen got to New York to fill a quorum, elected officials already began bickering over moving the capital. The Pennsylvania delegation came to New York with a plan to move Congress back to their home state. All of the central states, including New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, were all vying to move the capital to their home state. Getting the capital meant more money for the local economy. Members would rent rooms and make use of local taverns. Many appointed officials would move to town. It would also be much easier for local delegates to travel between home and the capital if it was nearby. Plus, there was the prestige of hosting the nation's capital. There were all sorts of debates over whether the capital should be near the center of wealth or population. Bigger cities argued that they had the facilities in place to host the new government. Smaller towns in more rural areas touted the idea that the capital should be built anew to suit the new government's standards. Some argued that the capital should be built on the western frontier, somewhere out in the Northwest Territory, so that as the population moved further west, the capital would be more central. Others argued that a capital on the coast would make it easier for delegates and others to travel there by ship. Some argued for no permanent capital at all, arguing that the capital should move every few years so that no one region benefited permanently. Of course, there were all sorts of personal interests, as speculators who owned land in a particular area hoped that the capital would boost the value of their land. There were also a range of parochial interests. Southerners feared that if the capital moved to Pennsylvania, they would be unable to be attended by their slaves while working there. Debate entered the House floor in August of 1789, when Thomas Scott of Pennsylvania urged the government to be moved to his state. Congressman Fisher Ames of Massachusetts wrote about the politicking, deal-making, and vote-swapping being considered as each faction tried to get its way. Most of the Southern Bloc was willing to back a capital on the Potomac River, since that river, which bordered Virginia and Maryland, was about as far south as any northern state was willing to consider. By September, the Pennsylvania delegation negotiated an agreement with James Madison of Virginia to move the capital back to Philadelphia temporarily, with the intent of building a permanent capital on the Potomac. Pennsylvanians were gambling that once the capital moved there, they could fight to make it permanent in some later political fight. And to counter this proposal, the New England states and New York threw their support behind a permanent capital on the banks of the Susquehanna River, which is in central Pennsylvania, with the capital remaining temporarily at least in New York City. This gambit divided the large Pennsylvania delegation on the question because some of them wanted it in Philadelphia and others were happier to have it out in western Pennsylvania. Madison still tried to sell the Potomac option as the most central and also with easy access to western territories as the nation grew. There was a belief at the time that the Potomac River would become the gateway to the West as the Potomac River Company improved the passageway across the river. Now, some Southerners backed this location with the argument that Northern Federalists had already won votes on so many other issues that forcing a Northern capital might cause Southern delegates to rethink remaining in the Union at all. They also argued that the Southern population was the fastest growing region, meaning a more Southern capital would be closer to the population center in future years. Massachusetts Congressman Theodore Sedgwick retorted that the growing South was mostly slaves, who really shouldn't even be considered part of the population. And this isn't really racism. Remember, I talked about Sedgwick in an earlier episode. He had represented a woman named Mumbet, now called Elizabeth Freeman, arguing in court that the Massachusetts Constitution invalidated slavery in that state. So Sedgwick was one of the earliest abolitionists. Sedgwick also argued that the Potomac was just too miserable an environment, especially for Northerners. He noted the number of New Englanders who died of disease soon after moving to those southern climates. In the fall of 1789, the House voted pretty decisively, 32-19, to move the permanent capital to the banks of the Susquehanna in Pennsylvania. They voted to appoint 3 commissioners to select the best site, to purchase the land, and to begin a 4-year construction of the new capital. In the meantime, the capital would remain in New York. The plan, however, fell apart in the Senate. Even Robert Morris, one of the Pennsylvania senators, refused to support the site in Pennsylvania. He wanted the capital to be in Philadelphia, or nearby, at least in the suburb of Germantown. Morris offered a gift of $100,000 to start the building process if Congress agreed to his site. Morris managed to change enough votes to get a tie in the Senate for Germantown, with Vice President Adams breaking the tie in favor of the Germantown location. The amended bill returned to the House. In order to prevent a final vote, Madison amended the bill again for another change near the end of the session, demanding an insertion that Pennsylvania law would apply to the new capital, at least until federal laws could be created. By creating any change at all, this change sent the bill back to the Senate, which at that point voted to postpone the question to the next session, since they were too busy finishing other work in those final days of the first session. When Congress returned to its second session in January 1790, opponents of the Germantown location blocked immediate consideration by establishing a rule that all proposed laws had to be reintroduced from scratch in the new session. Congress could not simply continue with its work on the existing bill. The result was that the issue languished for months as Congress focused on other matters. Now, one of the other matters that took up Congress's attention was that of the federal debt. Remember, that was one of the main reasons that leaders wanted this new federal government. It was so they could finally do something to pay down that war debt. Both the Continental Congress and the states had borrowed heavily to finance the war. All those Continental dollars were notes that promised that the holders could eventually exchange them for gold or some other valuable metal at some future date. Many doubted that that date would ever come. It had been more than a decade since most of those notes had been issued, and almost nothing had been repaid. By the end of the war, in the early 1780s, this Continental money had become virtually worthless. It took between 500 and 1,000 Continental dollars to buy anything that would take only $1 in specie. The term "not worth a Continental dollar" became a common expression to describe something that had no value at all. This began to turn around a little bit after the adoption of the new Constitution. Speculators began buying up more Continental paper, hoping that the new government would finally exchange it for face value. I mentioned back in episode 365, when Washington gave his State of the Union address, that he made debt a priority for his administration. He had Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton working on a report which was released just after the president's address. Hamilton's report on public credit identified about $77 million worth of public debt. This included both the original emissions of debt plus compounded interest over the 10 or so years since the debt was at first incurred. The bulk of the debt, about $42 million, was owed to Americans holding Continental paper. Another $11 or $12 million was foreign debt owed primarily to France, with the remainder mostly coming from private banks in the Netherlands. The remaining roughly $25 million was not federal debt at all, but was state debt. This was not incurred by the federal government, but rather by state governments as part of their effort to win the Revolutionary War. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume the war debts that were held by the states, allowing all debt to be repaid in a more organized way. Hamilton argued that keeping the debt divided between the states and the federal government would only lead to collision, confusion, and interfering regulations. His proposal was a daunting one. The interest alone on the national debt would be about $4.5 million a year. This was more than 3 times the total revenue that the federal government expected to raise each year. Hamilton proposed to renegotiate some of the debt to lower interest rates, which of course would help with the interest repayments, and that the government could borrow additional funds in Europe at a lower interest rate and use that money to repay the higher interest loans. His plans also called for higher taxes to be used in a sinking fund. A sinking fund had been used before in Britain. It essentially means that the taxes raised would be dedicated to the purpose of repaying debt and could not be used for other things that Congress might want to spend money on. This would help assure investors of repayment and would help Hamilton to negotiate those lower interest rates that the country needed. Politically, this plan had the benefit of strengthening the federal government. Wealthy creditors waiting to be repaid would be more willing to support higher taxes to raise those funds. They would also be more focused on the well-being of the federal government and would support policies that protected the new government's stability and financial well-being. States would be relieved of their debts, so they could reduce property taxes that had led to unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion a couple years earlier. Not all states, however, liked this idea. Many states, particularly Virginia, had not taken on as much war debt as other states, and Virginia, as well as a few other states, had been more aggressive in paying down what debts they had. Maryland and North Carolina had already repaid all of their war debt. Other states, like Massachusetts and South Carolina, were still swamped in debt. Those 2 states alone accounted for more than 40% of all state debt. Why should the slacker states be relieved of debt that all the other states would now be responsible for paying? The result was that states that did not have much debt opposed the idea of state assumption. Another major criticism was that most of the money raised would be going to money speculators. These were men who bought up this paper at pennies on the dollar and now expected to be paid in full. Opponents argued that original holders of paper, of which there were almost none, could be paid back in full, but that others, these speculators, would have to sell their paper at market rates, which before this plan was still only a few cents on the dollar. Speculators even rushed down to southern states to buy up paper before word of Hamilton's plan reached those states. Many believed that money speculators should not be rewarded for their sharp dealings. They should get their money back and maybe a little more, but not this huge windfall that paying back the paper at full value would give them. Hamilton strongly supported repayment at face value. He argued that it would be ruinous to federal credit if the federal government refused repayment as promised at face value. This would make it harder to renegotiate lower interest rates on all debt. The government must keep its promises to repay the debt in full to the current holder of that debt. Hamilton expected James Madison of Virginia to support his plan. The 2 men had discussed this back in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, and they had worked closely together during the ratification process and seemed to be in agreement on a whole host of issues, including a lot of financial ones. Even as late as November of 1789, Hamilton had written to Madison about the issue, and Madison said nothing about any concerns over assumption of state debt. Of course, Hamilton didn't raise the issue either, but the 2 men had discussed it before and seemed to be in agreement. But by 1790, Congressman Madison had to support the interests of Virginia. It was not in Virginia's interest to let the federal government assume state debts, and Virginia voters were not crazy about enriching money speculators at the expense of higher taxes on themselves. Madison had written before that enriching speculators at the expense of workers would only encourage more people to engage in speculation, and less of the population would do actual work. Madison also disliked the plan for the same reason that Hamilton liked it. debt would help to consolidate power in the federal government at the expense of the states. Government taxing power would give it too much economic power over the state economies. So Madison became a leading opponent of Hamilton's plan. He proposed numerous changes, such as buying debt from speculators at market value, and of having the federal government reimburse states for debts that they had already paid. Madison also hoped to keep the revenue at the state level rather than having the federal government collect and disperse everything. The result of Madison's opposition was that the House Committee of the Whole voted against Hamilton's debt plan in April of 1790. 2 weeks after that, the House voted to discontinue debate on assumption of debts entirely. In early June, Congress voted to support some portions of the plan, including trying to get new loans to pay interest on the existing debt and to create the sinking fund to reassure creditors, and strong support from Northern delegates also agreed to pay off all the debts at full face value. Missing from this vote was the assumption of state debts. Now, despite these votes, negotiations continued. Northern states were demanding the assumption of all state debts, and Hamilton believed that assumption was a key component of his overall plan. Shortly after the June vote, which left out assumption, Hamilton met with members of the Pennsylvania delegation, hoping to trade their support for assumption by agreeing to round up more votes to move the capital to Pennsylvania. At the same time, those Pennsylvania delegates were negotiating with Virginia delegation to move the permanent capital to Virginia after moving it temporarily to Philadelphia. There's a famous story told by Thomas Jefferson several years after these events that he came across a dejected-looking Hamilton a few weeks after his assumption loss in Congress. As Jefferson tells the story, he agreed to have Hamilton and Madison to a dinner at his house to discuss a compromise plan. It was at this dinner that Jefferson got the major players to agree to a compromise plan where Congress would vote to allow the assumption of debts and that the capital would move to Philadelphia for a few years, but then finally establish its permanent location on the banks of the Potomac. There's no reason to doubt this story, that the final details of the agreement were worked out at Jefferson's dinner. But it's clear that various parties had been discussing this deal for a few weeks prior. Madison could not support the assumption bill, not if he wanted to get reelected at least. He did, however, agree not to actively oppose the bill, and he also agreed that he would find at least 3 Southern congressmen who would back assumption. In exchange, Hamilton agreed to use his influence with New England and New York senators and congressmen to permit the permanent location of the capital to be placed on the Potomac River. He also agreed to get the Pennsylvania delegation on board. They agreed to move the capital back to Philadelphia right away, and that it would remain there for 10 years. Hamilton also agreed to recalculate Virginia's debt in a way that assured that the taxes collected from Virginians would be about equal to the amount that Virginia would receive for its assumed debts. The compromise seemed to work. Madison secured 2 votes from Virginia and 2 votes from Maryland to support the assumption bill, thus allowing it to pass in late July. A few weeks prior to that, the House narrowly passed a residence bill, which, as agreed, moved the capital to Philadelphia for 10 years, then permanently to a location on the Potomac River. President Washington, who supported both bills, happily signed both of them into law. By August, everything was done. Days after completion of this grand compromise, Congress completed its session and returned home. New York in particular was unhappy with this deal. They were not crazy about assumption and very much wanted to keep the capital. Opponents saw this as a blatant political horse trading and called it indecent. Many New Yorkers were even critical of President Washington himself, claiming that he pushed this through so the capital could be near his home. Also, as expected, Virginians were unhappy with what they saw as a surrender to Northern speculators. Opponents saw this as a betrayal of Republican liberty by putting so much economic power in the hands of the federal government. Back in Richmond, Patrick Henry got the Assembly to vote on an official condemnation of the compromise, and they petitioned Congress to repeal the assumption law. They did, however, seem okay with moving the capital to Virginia. And despite these angry responses by some, most moderates seemed to accept the deal and were happy to put these 2 divisive disputes behind them. Washington's approval of the deal also seemed to satisfy many. Many of the New Englanders, as well as indebted South Carolina, were happy with the assumption plan. Philadelphians were happy to get the return of the capital. Even though it was temporary, many still hoped that they could make it permanent by the end of the decade. And while there was a great deal of fighting and conflict, the first Congress had completed its work, and members returned home at the end of the summer to prepare for their first re-election bids in the fall. Next week, we will take a closer look at the new country as it begins its first national census. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Chasen Harrison, and Gordon Kemp. I also want to thank Brian Peer for joining the Revolution on Patreon as a standard bearer. Anyone who joins at the $10 level or higher will receive a magnet each month with a different flag from the Revolutionary War. And remember that I will be issuing special limited edition magnets each month in 2026, so now is a great time to join. This week we covered the so-called Grand Compromise. This was the effort to trade votes on two highly controversial issues, the assumption of state debt and the placement of the capital. Members opposed to one of the other issues were willing to trade votes to get both things through Congress. Many of us may know this deal because it was popularized in the musical Hamilton song, The Room Where It Happens, this being a reference to the private dinner in Jefferson's home where the final deal was made. Being in that room meant being in the very powerful elite circle of men who actually impacted the course of the nation. Jefferson later recounted the story in a way that made it sound like he made it all happen by bringing two hopelessly divided parties together, Hamilton and Madison, to forge this compromise. As I said in the main show, though, there were already discussions for such a deal. Jefferson's dinner just seemed to finalize the terms. 2 years after the deal, though, Jefferson told President Washington that making the deal was probably one of the biggest political mistakes of his life. Jefferson claimed he did not fully understand the consequences of the deal. The cause of Jefferson's regret is that he did not fully appreciate just how powerful the debt assumption would make the new federal government. It gave the federal government primary taxing authority in the country. It also divided the new government, as Jefferson saw it, into the true believers of Republican government and the rich moneyed interests that sought to control the new government. This resulted in a permanent division between the Federalists, led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison. Now, Jefferson, of course, did fully understand the terms of the deal. What he didn't appreciate was just how much economic power this debt deal was going to create. In the next Congress, Hamilton proposed creation of the Bank of the United States, which both Jefferson and Madison strongly opposed. Despite their opposition, the bank was created, and that further consolidated the power of moneyed interests. Over the course of the Washington and Adams administrations, the debt actually grew from an estimated $71 million in 1790 to about $83 million in 1801 when President Jefferson took office. Jefferson aggressively paid down the debt during his time in office, thinking that elimination of that debt would reduce the power of the moneyed interests in government. Hamilton had created a plan in 1795 to pay off the debt in 30 years, so by 1825, Hamilton hoped to reach that goal, even though it probably meant that none of them would live to see it. Jefferson aggressively paid off over $30 million toward the debt during his 8 years in office. About 3/4 of all federal revenue went to debt repayment. Of course, Jefferson also added to the debt, mostly because of the Louisiana Purchase. But even with that purchase, U.S. debt was down to $57 million when Jefferson left office, about $26 million lower than when he took office. Jefferson's successor, Madison, continued to pay down the debt, at least until the War of 1812 began, and that war exploded the debt back to all-time highs. So if Jefferson thought this whole deal was a mistake, why did he go along with it? Even in letters that he wrote at the time he was making the deal, Jefferson conceded that he was opposed to the idea of assumption of state debts. He said that he made the deal because he was afraid that without it, the Union might have been broken. In a letter to James Monroe, Jefferson noted that without a deal, U.S. credit might fall apart and the government would be unable to get new loans at better rates. Leaving states like Massachusetts with massive debt might cause all of New England to secede from the Union and break away. So once again, leaders were making compromises on important issues in order to maintain the existence of the United States. My book recommendation this week is Dinner at Mr. Jefferson's: 3 Men, 5 Great Wines, and an Evening That Changed America by Charles Cerami. As you might guess from the title, this book focuses on the dinner hosted by Thomas Jefferson, where he got Hamilton and Madison to hammer out that final deal over the Residence Act and the assumption of state debt. The book goes into as much detail as is known about the dinner itself and the final deal, but it also tries to put the whole thing in context. This book was published in 2008. The author has written a number of books related to the early federal era. So if you want to read more on this topic, get Dinner at Mr. Jefferson's: 3 Men, 5 Great Wines, and an Evening That Changed America by Charles Cerami. Just as a reminder, if you use my book links on my blog or in my podcast notes to get to Amazon, I get a commission on whatever you purchase. It's a great way to support this podcast. My online recommendation is Thomas Jefferson's personal account of the events, which he wrote down for his personal papers about 2 years after the fact. It's the best first-hand account that we have of these events. The transcript is available at Founders Online in the National Archives, and of course I've included direct links to that transcript in my notes and on my blog. My question comes from Jeff Rosenfeld, who asks, I wonder if, after Arnold delayed Carleton in 1776, if he really needed to fight at Valcour Island, he had already accomplished his strategic objective. Well, Jeff, as I discussed in the episodes about Valcour Island, Benedict Arnold delayed a British advance into New York from Canada by maintaining a fleet on Lake Champlain. General Carleton was unwilling to take on the American fleet until he had an overwhelming force that could defeat that enemy fleet. As a result, the British spent most of 1776 building a larger fleet, and this result delayed in the British offensive not starting until October of that year. When the British fleet finally sailed down Lake Champlain, Arnold famously hid his fleet behind Valcour Island, then attacked the British from behind. Because Arnold had the advantageous location, he was able to hold off the fleet for a day, then amazingly slipped through the British fleet at night to escape. Arnold's actions caused the British fleet to turn around and deal with him, perhaps delaying their arrival at Fort Ticonderoga for a day or two. I noted in these episodes that Arnold had won strategically by delaying the British offensive for months, so the fact that the British destroyed his tiny fleet really meant little. And that, of course, raises the question that you ask. What if Arnold had just followed orders and retreated with his fleet back to Fort Ticonderoga? The delay had already taken place, and there was no strategic value in putting his men and guns at risk by confronting the British at Valcour. Now, it is certainly possible that the British could have sailed down to Ticonderoga and then decided to return home again without a battle anyway. However, I argue that there needed to be some battle, and that if the British had attacked Ticonderoga, they might have succeeded in taking it. The loss of Arnold's fleet arguably gave the British commander the combat that he needed to report home, and a victory for the year by taking out that fleet. This arguably made the naval battle itself pretty important. Also, the Americans were trying to impress on the British that even if the British could move wherever they wanted, they were going to pay a price for every movement. They would be attacked and lose men and resources, regardless of the outcome of the battle. Arnold was reinforcing that point by attacking the British fleet at Valcour. The battle also reinforced Arnold's reputation as a fighter. Washington expected his officers to attack the enemy whenever possible. Arnold was doing what was expected of him. I take the point of your question. If Arnold had retreated without a fight, the final outcome might have been the same. The British might still have withdrawn to Canada because of the early winter, but the word might is always an important one. No one can say for certain, and Arnold wasn't going to take the chance that his attack might not matter. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.